The Minnesota Police Union is speaking out for the first time since the death of George Floyd.
The city is trying to scapegoat the Federation, that we are to blame in this, and it's simply not the case.
What the union head has to say about the 4 officers' actions. Plus, one of the Kentucky police officers involved in the death of Breonna Taylor is officially fired from the force. And newly obtained disciplinary records of the officer who used a fatal chokehold during the 2014 arrest of Eric Garner. How many misconduct cases the officer had before Garner died. That case and much more. Right now on Law and Crime Special Report, Keeping the Peace. It's Tuesday, June 24th, 2020. Okay, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. My name is Bob Bianchi. This is the special report, Keeping the Peace, June 24th, 2020. Got a lot to cover. Let's go to George Floyd. The police union is speaking out. There's been a lot of controversy that the union has actually been part of the problem here and that they haven't spoken out. And we actually have a Lieutenant Bob Kroll, who is the Minneapolis Police Federation head, that's speaking with respect to this case now. Is it too late? And what does he have to say? Let's take a quick listen.
Same video others have seen, and it's terrifying. It's horrible. It's a tragic event. It should have never happened. You're not going to find one Minneapolis cop that condones that. Certainly not us.
What do you mean by that?
It should have never happened. It's unacceptable in our profession, and very regrettable, tragic situation that should have never happened.
Are you saying that Officer Derek Chauvin handled this wrong?
Absolutely.
What did he do, in your mind, that's wrong?
Well, I think the video that we've all seen speaks for itself. You've got a duty to render aid. We didn't see that. You've got people saying, hey, check them. You've got other officers saying, turn on the side.
Were the other officers derelict in their duties?
We got to wait for some due process and see the rest of this as it plays out. There's much more. We've only seen what's been shown on television.
Okay, Dr. Cedric Alexander, 4 decades in law enforcement, a national TV contributor, author of In Defense of Public Service, How 22 Million Government Workers Will Save Our Republic. Doctor, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So talk to me a little bit about your opinions about this. The head of that union says, we did not want to inflame later in the interview already a tense situation, so that's why we haven't come out. I'm curious about what your thoughts are about that, because they didn't want to exacerbate the tension. But he also, what are your thoughts about the idea that when asked, was it wrong and why was it wrong? And with respect to the other officers, he's saying, well, let due process play out. Why aren't they making a greater commitment?
Well, I think, first of all, let's be perfectly honest about something. The George Floyd case is pretty self-explainable. It was an actual murder, if you will, that took place right in front of millions of people in this country and around the globe. It's undeniable. So there is no escape clause for anybody in this particular case if you're asking them to make a judgment. This is an easy one to judge. There is no gray area here. It's just exactly what we see that it is. And so it's unfortunate, it's horrible, but it doesn't take a whole lot of intelligence to recognize it for what it is. Yeah. So, in the case of the union themselves, look, they probably did the best thing that they could do was not to say anything to inflame anything, because part of the union's image problem is that they retain bad officers. They pay for them to stay on the job. They defend them when they know that they're wrong. But this was the case that was just undeniable. So therefore, Chauvin, quite frankly, just get thrown to the wolves along with these other officers, in my opinion. But I think I understand what he's saying by just not saying anything at all. But had this been a different kind of case where it could have been more judgment involved, I would certainly then want to know what the thoughts and opinion of their union would have been.
You know, Doctor, you bring up a good point, and I just want to expand upon it a little bit about what it is that a police union, or any union for that matter, does. It advocates for its members. But one thing that this head of the Federation says, this lieutenant, is that we're not responsible for prosecutions. We are not responsible for how the city goes about disciplining employees. That's a police department function. We're a union that's negotiating collective bargaining agreements, which include how the disciplinary process occurs. But he also mentions that's a two-way street. Everybody was at the table. What do you think about that?
He is absolutely correct. And I have been saying this for some time. Unions do not make decisions around any type of bargaining by themselves. That's done in conjunction with city leaders, city attorneys, chiefs, etc. They come to a decision. It gets down to horse trading. You give me this, I'll give you that. So I can come into a city as a chief tomorrow, but if certain things have already been negotiated, where it may be difficult for me to, say for an example, discipline an officer because of the way that the contract is written, that is not the union's fault by themselves. Someone had to agree to that. So this whole notion that unions make these decisions by themselves, that is not true. Those decisions are made in conjunction with city leaders. But let me also add this. Unions are not there to build relationships in communities. Their job is to protect their membership. And that's what you pay dues for. But unfortunately, oftentimes, unions end up finding themselves in this precarious situation of having to defend officers in some cases in which they should not be defending, but they end up having to defend.
Right,
And
they have to. I'm sorry to cut you off, Doctor. They have to defend pursuant to the collective bargaining agreement.
That's
to the point that point that you were just making, though, he's basically saying we're being scapegoated here. And if you want to point the fingers, at least for reform, let's point them to the places where they lie. Let's listen to him talk about how the government officials have been responding to this.
Our investigative process and disciplinary process lies totally in the hands of city leaders. We just ensure due process for the members, no different than any other public sector union.
It's certainly not how you guys are being portrayed by...
Of course not, and it's a false narrative that needs to be corrected. The city is trying to scapegoat the Federation, that we are to blame in this, and it's simply not the case.
Let's talk about the perception that the union, and specifically you, Bob Kroll, are a racist.
Not true.
There are signs around town that call you KKK Kroll. Are you a racist?
Not at all. Not true. Again, false narrative. When you run out of arguments to be made, name call. And it's not factual. There is no basis. And I would like to see someone bring forth some proof, because this is absolutely unfounded.
All right, well, Doctor, to the point that you were just making before, he is advocating the same very idea that both of us are speaking about, that the union is there for the protection of its members. It has no law enforcement abilities. And then he's asked if he's a racist. He's called, KKK Bob. Listen, we don't know the track record or the history of that, or the disciplinary record with respect to any of those things. But let me ask you, I'm just asking, based on your decades-long law enforcement, as especially an African-American man, when law enforcement are in communities of color and they're aggressively, trying to root out crime, is it often that some people, not all, some will look at those officers as being over-officious and not respect the police, even though a majority of the community may appreciate what it is that the police are doing?
Well, here again, it all depends on which community that you're in. I mean, we have to look at the history of policing in this nation. There's always been conflict between police departments and more specifically, communities of color, Black and brown communities. So let's be honest with ourselves, is that we certainly do have police officers that will go into a community and espouse their negative beliefs or attitudes upon people, and that does exist. Let's not be foolish to believe that it does not. But the greatest majority of men and women out there, I truly believe, are doing their job based on their oath and based on the U.S. Constitution. The bigger problem is this. is that the good officers who knows that there are bad officers out there who are not conducting themselves appropriately, and they not saying anything about it, are just as complicit. So when
Well,
we hear
doctor,
this,
I have to
yeah,
let me from my experience. I used to handle
right,
civil rights cases, 1983 litigation, and
right,
I was the head prosecutor of a county eventually that was taking police to task when they did something wrong, with that experience
right,
behind me. You bring up such a good point about the department, and I think that this cannot be underscored.
hmm,
Those officers who knew, and I've had these cases where I've represented officers who knew there was a bad cop that was committing
right,
a lot of carnage in the community,
right,
and then, unfortunately, those officers, once they complained about it, they wound up on the crucible. They wound
hmm,
up having charges filed against them.
hmm,
They wound up fired in some places, not all. Doctor, I'm sorry. I
hmm.
wish we could get an answer to that, but I'm told we got to take a real quick break here. I love talking to you. Thanks so much. We'll catch you on the other side. Welcome back to Keeping the Peace. My name is Bob Bianchi. We're going to switch to Breonna Taylor. There's an update now. The officer involved in that, Brett Hankinson, has been officially fired. 4 counts of violating rules and regulations, 10 counts of violating use of deadly force. You guys, I'm sure, remember this case as a no-knock search warrant that was being executed by the police. And then the long and short, the cop fires 10 rounds. This victim, who was an EMT, 26 years old, was not a target of that investigation, and unfortunately, she was killed. Let's listen to the Louisville Mayor, Greg Fisher, as he discusses the termination.
Chief Schroeder is today initiating termination procedures against Louisville Metro Police Officer Brett Hankinson. Unfortunately, due to a provision in state law that I very much would like to see changed, both the chief and I are precluded from talking about what brought us to this moment or even the timing of this decision. I know that you will have questions, and I'm sorry that I cannot answer them because of the state law, ARS Chapter 67C.3261F.
Oh, doctor, I'm going to take a different spin on this than where most of the people are going with this particular case. That press conference annoys me, Doc. I'll tell you why. There are reasons why the law that he specifically cites so that he can CYA, and that's what this is, says that you cannot speak about pending litigation matters. What I'm worried about with all the reforms that we clearly need in this case is to remember these officers are also defendants. They are criminal defendants in some of these cases. They have proceedings against them in other cases. And one of the reasons as a prosecutor why I was not allowed under our laws as well to give expansive explanations as to what the facts are in the case, is so that it can be litigated not in the court of public opinion, but in the courtroom. And I'm worried that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater with some of these kind of comments. That kind of law is meant to preserve the integrity of the judicial system. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's a delicate balance here. Anytime you have a officer involved shooting, whether it's one that is immediately justifiable, or whether it's one that's questionable, or whether it's one that went off the rails, such as very much sound like here in Breonna Taylor case, it becomes important that you have to protect the integrity of the investigation. Revealing too much information too soon for public consumption, when all the facts are not in detail through that would outline a course of investigation, we have to be very leery of. But can you give people an overview of what we know in some way without any specificity? Yes, because people want to be able to know something. They want to be able to hear something from their leadership. But I do support the fact that in these types of investigations, we have to be very, very cautious how much is shared, because we don't want to prejudice the investigation. We don't want to give out information that one day look one way, but tomorrow it may look something entirely different, because it's still in the very early stages or middle of an investigation.
You know, Doctor, that is so prescient what you're saying and so accurate. It's not just the courtroom too that we have to worry about a fair trial,
Right.
but I had to get up there and give those press conferences, and it was a delicate
Right.
balance to give the community, especially in a police-related fatality, some
Right.
information without poisoning the investigation. To the point I think you're making, even when you do that, when facts spill out into the media, not from us. They spill out from
Right.
all sources and what have you, and you're interviewing critical witnesses to the case, and they're telling you things like,
Mhm.
well, I really don't remember, but I read it in the paper. That becomes a
Mhm.
problem for us in pursuing a criminal prosecution against a
Right.
police officer or any defendant.
That's right. That's right. That's right. You're absolutely right. We just have to be very cautious. We have to be thoughtful. We have to be methodical because at the end of the day, regardless of what happens, there need to be a fair and balanced investigation. And the facts are going to reveal what it reveals, such as in this particular case, there were clear facts to reveal that they had enough reason, enough evidence in order to terminate this officer involved in this horrific event.
All right, we got to move on, but just real quick, being a guy on the street for 4 decades, is this training? Are these cops with these no-knock warrants? One of my tactical operations captains would say to me, they've lost the training about putting hands on people. They're using this overwhelming force, and these cops are
Right.
scared when they're going in there, and this happens. Not that that's justifiable, but I mean,
Mm.
firing 10 rounds blankly into a room where an innocent person's killed? What's happening?
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be interesting to find out in this particular case, even if the warrant was issued legitimately, and if the facts that were written into the warrant for a judge to sign, all that is going to be looked at and determined, and made sure that nothing was falsely put in front of a judge. But this was a horrible incident. No knock warrants. We all need to go back and revisit the whole idea around no knocks because we're seeing too many cases where no knock warrants are not paying off. We're seeing poor preparation by police, such as what we saw here in Louisville. It's a tragic event that should have never happened. That house probably should have never been hit. And so here is what we have. And when you talk about reforms, all this needs to be looked at when it relates to police reform. And police, quite frankly, really don't have anybody to blame but themselves, because if you don't prepare and you're not doing this in a methodical and well thought out and planned for way, if you rush to judgment and you don't do things the way you know that you should do them or the way that you were trained to do them, then this is the kind of mess it's going to get you in, and it becomes a black eye for the entire law enforcement community across the country. And good departments and good officers have to suffer as a result of it.
Good, very, very, very fair points. You know, you always wonder, I've always, as a lawyer, even though I was in charge of the law enforcement agencies, going in there in the early morning hours with a no-knock and flashbangs going off. If there's a guy that's doing, or person that's doing bad things there, they don't know
Right.
what's happening. They may think somebody's there to rob them, do something bad to them or
That's
whatever,
right.
and it creates a toxic situation. Got to move on, though, Doc, because here we got this interesting thing with the death of Eric Garner. New York law has changed and now allowing the revelation of IA complaints, former complaints that were typically shielded from the public view, and in many instances, the lawyer's view. I could tell you how much this was frustrating. Now those records are allowed to be out, and we find out that there were 7 misconduct cases against that officer. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts with, let's just take a quick look. I think we have sound on tape here with this. Let me just see real quick. All right, Doc, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. One of the policy reasons as to why internal affairs complaints that were not sustained against an officer are typically not made public was because of the idea that there are people in the community that purposely file false complaints against officers, maybe because of retribution or what have you. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but that is the policy reason as to why they weren't released. What bothered me as a civil rights attorney was that when I had, and I think I just told you, a case recently, or not recently, years ago, where I had to go to court sometimes 15 and 20 times as a lawyer pursuing a civil rights litigation to get the internal affairs records, which are so important because to the point you made before, I believe it was on air, may have been off air, that tells us whether the department is functioning correctly with respect to taking internal affairs seriously and forms the basis of a civil rights case. What are your thoughts about the change in the New York law and how it will affect litigation going forward?
Well, this is reform that's coming. In many states in the country, particularly non-union states, those IA records have always been available to the public. In many of your unionized police environments, they have not been, such as New York State. And what the people in the state of New York have said to the governor, and the governor there has agreed with, is that these types of public officials, police officers, their records should be available to the public to be able to see what their conduct and behavior has been. Because we're just moving in a different period now where people are holding policing far more accountable than what they have in the past, and they're asking far more questions. And we as law enforcement officials and leaders, we have a responsibility to respond to the will of people that live in that community, and people in the state of New York, people in the city,
Doc,
certainly are asking these questions, and they want something done. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. In my state, at least, we were never, as prosecutors, allowed to file charges against people who ultimately had filed bogus complaints. I could think of 3 in particular that were captured on a webcam as a policy decision. If, in fact, this is going to be opened, should there be prosecutions of people who file false complaints, provably false complaints against police officers?
Absolutely. If they're provably false complaints, and many of those laws are already on the books, if you file a false police report, you could be subject to an arrest. That is absolutely true. And that law should remain on the books. Because we can't have people out here making false complaints if they're proven to be false in that regard. But in terms of making internal affairs complaints, people should be forthright and they should be honest. And police officers themselves are going to have to be forthright and honest in writing and documenting reports accurately as well.
Absolutely agree. Dr. Cedric Alexander, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Stay tuned for regularly scheduled program. We'll be back tomorrow.